please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Well, you're speaking about pushing blame around, and the government has picked up this 80-20 gold scheme as, one of the ways in which people were allowed to make money. What are your comments on, you must have heard what the government said about this.
Well, I mean, I have to say, as far as I understand, the PNB scheme scam started in 2011 and was unearthed in 2018.
Yeah.
The gold scheme that is under the scanner at this point was something which lasted between May 2014 and November 2014. It seems to me very hard to argue that whatever happened there, and I'm happy to talk more about that, but whatever happened there was in any way related to the scam, other than it happened in the same industry that there was gold involved. But I think it's important to treat these as two separate issues. I'm happy to talk about the 80-20 because I think the actions there, as far as I understand, were justified. But I think it's important to keep it separate from the scam. People conflate this all the time, and I think this seems to be a diversion of public interest rather than a focus on the key issues, which are important. Why is it that our banking system is leaking so much? How do we prevent the leaks, especially when there's so much new money going into the banking system as recapitalization?
Okay. Well, I take your point that this is, 80-20 is a gold scam and the LOUs happened on diamonds and the two are not related. Completely taken. But let me just delve on this 80-20 scheme. It goes as liberalization of, the number of people who could import. But it looks like only some people benefited. Is there not, how would you answer to that charge?
Well, first, what happens with a number of issues is the RBI is supposed to, talk with the government. The government sort of is often the prime mover, and the RBI is then supposed to ask whether the policy can be implemented and then announce the policy. Now, on the 80-20 gold scheme, remember the circumstances in which it was brought about. We had a foreign exchange crisis in 2013, and there was a great sense that the current account deficit was getting out of control. A big part of the current account deficit was big purchases of gold as real interest rates were strongly negative. And so when the public was moving into gold in a big way, the government thought that perhaps one stopgap arrangement, a temporary arrangement, would be to reduce the imports of gold. And so it brought in this 80-20 scheme, which said basically out of every 100 grams that you import of gold, you have to re-export 20. And there are a few entities, State Trading Corporation, etc., and a few public sector banks that would be allowed to import. That had a very important effect in quelling the imports of gold, which also meant that the pent-up demand to some extent for gold was building up because our jewelry industry was at a loss given that gold had been stopped. At this point, the Commerce Department started arguing that, well, maybe we should have some liberalization and we should open it up to more players to import gold so that there's more free flow of gold into the system. Obviously, with any liberalization, if you actually implement it, gold imports will go up. The question is, who was allowed to implement? And there, as I understand it, again, I have to collect this information at a distance, the Department of Trade in the Commerce Ministry has a criterion of who it nominates as star exporters, star trading houses, prime exporters, and that objective criterion was available. And as I understand it, that criterion was then used to say, here are the guys who can import. Now, the whole objective was to bring down the premium that had built up and which the government has acknowledged in its note that had built up in the gold trading because of the constraints on supply. So liberalization would have brought down that premium considerably. Of course, the ultimate aim, and why were we able to liberalize? Because we had weathered the first part of the crisis. We had built up reserves somewhat. There's a little more confidence that things were a little better.
Okay.
Now, further, of course, the ultimate aim was this was a constraint on our industry, on industry which employs a lot of people. So the ultimate aim was to get rid of it completely. The scheme that is under controversy was run during the first few months of the NDA regime, and finally it was done away with in November 2014.
Yes.
Now, I mean, like any constraints that are imposed on a market system, there would have been some people who made money and some people who didn't. The people who didn't make money objected against the people who did make money, but the people who made money were objecting against others. This kind of thing keeps going on. So ultimately, the idea was to bring back free trading. That's what happened, and that's a good thing.
Okay. No, the charge, Dr. Rajan, is that the circular came on May 13th. When a regime change was in the offing, and therefore, in a sense, mala fide in intent.
Well, you know, I don't want to go into that. I understand this is a big issue in Parliament, etc. The point I think it is important to remember is that this is a period of rapid regulatory change as we're dealing with the foreign exchange crisis. There were a number of ad hoc schemes, ad hoc arrangements, and you know, I can see that there could have been some arguments made that this new government is going to take time to understand, maybe we need to bring it in. I don't know what the rationale was behind the government at that time. The point from our perspective as the RBI was to understand whether there was any objective criteria for doing what was being done. The logic being that we had weathered the foreign exchange crisis, that in fact there were constant representations from the gold industry that there was a shortage of gold, and to some extent there was pent-up demand which was potentially creating other problems. So I think that our job was to see, is this done in a reasonable way? I have not been able to go back to the circulars that were issued and the underlying discussions. What happens in these cases is the department takes care of it and talks to the government and issues them. But of course, as governor, I do bear responsibility for any actions of the RBI.
But could you have said no? Or is this entirely a government preserve and RBI is only an implementer?
No, well, let me put it this way. Any policy has ramifications, both positive and negative. The positive ramifications of any liberalization is that you increase the imports of the object that you've stopped in order to facilitate more work in the industry. There was arguments that a lot of workers have been laid off because of a shortage of gold. We need to re-employ them. So you have to look at that positive aspect. Second, we did not want to liberalize fully because we did not want the flood of gold to come in.
Okay.
We had to do it in steps. If you want to do it in steps, obviously you have to pick somebody to import. There's already the public sector which is importing. You're not stopping them from importing. So in a sense, this is a liberalization. You are adding more people. That has to bring down the premium on gold, which was partly the objective. But you know, when you pick them, the question is, what objective criteria do you follow? If there is a definition by the Department of Trade, that was what the government picked and told us this seems reasonable. And, you know, we looked at the definition and that seemed reasonable. I presume that's the process we followed. And we went out and, you know, in consultation with the government, issued the circular. Now, the new government, if it thought this was a issue of importance, could have acted immediately. As I understand, you know, it took some time to see how this process worked, and eventually, when we had more foreign exchange under our belt, we did away with the scheme. So, to some extent, I think procedures were followed, which is what is important in these situations.
Okay. Well, let me come back to the reason why I invited you about reorganizing public sector banks or reimagining them.